The Graph API is the primary way to get data in and out of Facebook's platform. It's the way you publish Open Graph stories, read information about the user, and update information within Facebook's graph. The Graph API is a RESTful JSON API, which means you can access it in a standard web browser. But to help you understand how to use and traverse the graph, we've built a tool called the Graph API Explorer, which makes it really easy to get started. Let's load the Graph API Explorer, which you can find at developers.facebook.com/tools/explorer. Assuming that you're currently logged into Facebook, you'll see the response window contains a JSON object containing two properties, an ID and your name. At this point, we should pause to talk about why the Graph API is called the Graph API. A graph is how Facebook represents all its data. A graph is really about two things: objects, also known as nodes, and connections, which describe the links between these nodes. Every user on Facebook is represented as an object. Within Facebook, places, pages, photos, events, and newsfeed stories, as well as users, are all considered objects. Every object has an ID. We'll come back to connections in a few minutes. What we see now in the Graph API Explorer is the object which represents you. Your name and ID are fields on that object. But you're more than just an ID and a name. Let's try deselecting the ID and name attributes on the left-hand side and then resubmit the call to the API. Depending on your privacy settings, you'll get a bit more data back, including your gender, your locale, and your username. These are additional fields on your user object, and these are the default values returned when no fields are specified in the request to the API. At this point, it's worth taking note of a couple of things. Firstly, every node in the graph has an ID. We can reference these objects with their numeric ID, but we can also reference them using their username, if the object has one. Let's try it by swapping out my numeric user ID for my username, in this case, Cycross. We get the same result. We can also make queries on other public objects if we know their ID or their username. For example, other users, or Facebook pages, like this one for Coca-Cola. The next thing to note is that while we're using the Graph API Explorer, we're actually just making basic HTTP requests to Facebook's servers. We could run any of these queries directly in the browser. As we're just making HTTP calls, it's really easy to integrate the Graph API into any technology stack you're using. You just need an HTTP client library and a library for parsing JSON. However, to make it really easy, there's a bunch of SDKs for popular languages like Ruby, Python, Java, and .NET, which make accessing the Graph API super simple from within your code. There's a list of these SDKs at developers.facebook.com/docs/SDKs. While we've only done get so far, we can also use the Graph API Explorer to do deletes, if we want to delete some object in the graph, or posts, if we want to update objects and connections in the graph. We'll see how these work a little later. For everything we've done up to now, we've not needed to be logged into Facebook, or to have authorized the Graph API Explorer to have access to my personal view of the graph. If we do want to use the Explorer to access my list of friends, for example, we'll need to give it permission to do so. This is where Facebook Login comes in. Facebook Login allows an app to have access to your personal view of the graph, much the same view that you would have if you were using Facebook in the browser. For now, you can see that we've been calling the Graph API anonymously, as there's currently no access token listed in this box. An access token is a special key which the app needs to call the Graph API on behalf of you, the user. To get an access token, let's start the Facebook login flow. So, to log into the Graph API Explorer app, let's click on the Get Access Token button. Before we see the login dialog, the Graph API Explorer asks us which additional permissions we want to request from the user. Now, by default, an app can only access a limited set of data from your Facebook account, the user's public profile and their friends list. But apps can request additional permissions which, if the user agrees, can give your app access to more information about them. For example, their likes and interests, date of birth, or their email address. Another notable permission gives the app the ability to publish content back to Facebook. For example, to upload a photo the user's taken, or to check them into a place. It's important to us at Facebook that users feel comfortable using their apps and that they know what data the app has access to. This is why whenever an app asks you to log in, or when an app wants to ask you for additional permissions, we give the user a clear dialog which explains what the app is and exactly what data it's asking for. But we'll come back and look at permissions in more detail later. In this first case, we won't request any additional permissions, so we'll just click the Get Access Token button again. Now we see the Facebook login dialog, which is asking us if we want to log into the Graph API Explorer. It's telling us that the app will get access to our public profile and friends lists, so let's go ahead and click OK. Now the login dialog has closed, we now have an access token here in the box at the top. The Graph API Explorer will use this access token in all subsequent requests we make to the Graph API. In fact, if we click the debug button, we can find out a ton more information about this access token, including the app and user it was generated for, the platform it was generated on, and when this token is due to expire. Going back to the Graph API Explorer, let's run the basic request for my user ID again. We can see now that we're getting a bit more data back in the response. This data is only available once you're querying the Graph API with an access token as a logged in user. At this point, it's worth mentioning that instead of querying the Graph API by the object ID, we can now query it using two special tokens, /me and /app. Calling graph.facebook.com/me is the same as calling the Graph API with my user ID. Calling graph.facebook.com/app is the same as calling the Graph API with the app ID for the application which was used to generate this access token. In this case, it's the app ID for the Graph API Explorer. Most apps tend to build the requests in their app using /me and /app in their code, as it's super convenient and means you don't have to bake the current user's user ID into each request you make to the Graph API. Now that we've logged into this app, not only can we get a little bit more information about the current user, we can query our first connection on the user object, the friends connection. Remember, the Graph API is all about objects, users, and connections which link other objects. To call the friends connection, we just call /me/friends. This will return an array of users who are my friends. I can click on the ID of each of these users, and this makes a query to the Graph API to get the public profile information about each of my friends. The amount of data we can access about the current user's friends is very limited. For example, we can't get the friends of these friends. If we try and do that, we'll get an error. We can only get the friends of the current user. Going back to the list of the current user's friends, this information is a little basic at present. We just have each friend's name and ID. If we wanted to link to the user's profile page, for example, or show the profile picture of each friend, we need a bit more information. Luckily, the Graph API lets us build powerful queries which return more data on each object in the connection. So let's go ahead and request some additional fields: the name, the first name, the last name, and the username fields. Running this query takes a little longer, but you can see that we now have a little more data about each friend. The Graph API Explorer builds up the URL for each request, but as with every Graph API request, you could do this yourself in a browser using any HTTP client. Like Inception, we can kind of go further, deeper and deeper into the graph. We can also request the picture connection on each returned user object. This would allow me, for example, to show the profile picture of each of my friends, and critically, to get all of this data in a single request. Again, as the query takes a little longer, but now we have the first name, last name, username, profile picture for each of the current user's friends. Finally, we can even specify extra additional properties on the fields returned in the picture connection. Let's say we want images which are 100 pixels wide and 200 pixels high. The Explorer helps us build these queries to the Graph API using a dot syntax. Let's run this query again. This time, you'll see that we have a picture returned for each of the user's friends, Each of these images is 100 pixels wide by 200 pixels tall. So you can see that using the Graph API, we can build up some pretty powerful queries that delve deep into the graph. While more complex queries take more time to return, there are cases where requesting all of this data in a single request has huge advantages. If you're a mobile developer, for example, you'll know that the main overheads in making requests to a remote server are in waking up the radio and in the latency taken for each HTTP round trip to complete. By requesting more data in a single HTTP request, you're minimizing the network latency you'd get if you had to make HTTP requests for, say, each of the user's friends. Let's go back to the object for the currently logged in user. At the moment, the Graph API Explorer only has permission to access my public data and my friends list. But let's say I was building an app about movie recommendations. To do this, I want to know the user's likes and interests. I also, say, want to be able to email the user when a new movie comes out which matches their tastes. To get this data, we need to request the email field, which is part of the user object. We also need to request the likes connection on the user object. The likes connection lists all of the objects the user has liked. But if we try and do this, nothing is returned. We need additional permissions to access this data. So let's click on Get Access Token once more. Again, the Graph API Explorer is trying to help us out as developers by showing us the permissions that we can request from the user. For clarity, the Graph API Explorer groups them into a few groups, but the user data permissions group is the one we're most interested in here. To access the user's emails and their likes, we need the email permission and the user_likes permission. You can see other permissions here like user_hometown and user_birthday that we'd use if the app needed to know, say, your hometown or when your birthday was. But we don't need any other permissions at this stage. When we click Get Access Token, we'll see the Facebook login dialog again, this time telling us that the app wants access to our email and to our likes. Let's click OK and the dialog goes away. But when we make the same Graph API query again, you'll see we now get back the user's email and an array of their likes. Just like with the friends connection, we can click on the ID of each of these likes and we'll be taken to the node in the graph which represents this concept. This is what the Graph API is really all about, jumping between objects through connections. A couple more things to note here before we carry on. Firstly, your app should only ask for the fewest permissions it needs to get the job done. The more permissions you ask for, the less likely the user is to log into your app. Secondly, you need to code defensively in case a user doesn't grant you a particular permission. They could decide not to. Your app needs to handle this case gracefully and either explain to the user why this permission is essential or continue regardless that they didn't give it to you. You can see the permissions the user has granted your app by calling /me/permissions. You can even revoke a permission by doing a delete on /me/permissions/permission_name. Let's do this for /me/permissions/user_likes. This is really useful when you're testing things. For example, when you're testing the behavior of the API when a user hasn't granted you a certain permission. So we've covered the difference between nodes and connections, and we've used Facebook Login to request additional permissions to access, with permission of course, more of the user's data. All these permissions so far have been read permissions. They let you read more data from Facebook. But a common use case of apps which integrate with Facebook is that they want to help you share stories about your activity in this app back to Facebook. Spotify, for example, allows the songs you listen to appear on your Facebook timeline. When you go for a run using Nike Plus allows you to publish details about your run back to Facebook. For this, the apps need to request the special write permission. This is called publish_actions. It's essential that when you first build your app, you request read and write permissions separately. This is because we found most users are happy to give an access to more information about themselves, but until they feel comfortable using the app and really understand what it's going to do, they don't want to give the app permission to publish back to Facebook straight away. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this tutorial to show you how to publish rich stories back to Facebook. To learn how to do that, you should check out the Open Graph tutorial at developers.facebook.com/docs/opengraph. But we can use the Graph API to show you how to share a link with a message back to Facebook. To do this, we want to make a post to the user's feed connection. That's right, we can also write to connections as well as read from them. In this case, we're going to pass in a URL we want to share as well as a message which the user must have entered into a text box themselves within your app. But now, when we submit that request, we get an error. This is because the app has not yet requested permission to be able to publish back to Facebook. To get that permission, we again click Get Access Token, choose the special publishing permission known as publish_actions, and again, we see the login dialog being shown to ask the user for this permission. Once we've said OK, we can try and click this post again. This time, we get an ID back. This ID represents the story we've just published to Facebook. That's right, the story is an object as well. If I go over to my Facebook timeline, we can see this story here, and notably, it said that the story was shared via an app, in this case, the Graph API Explorer. So to recap, we've looked at how the Graph API is really a RESTful JSON API which we can call using any HTTP client or view in the browser. But while you're testing things out, the Graph API Explorer is a really easy way to help you build expansive queries and to understand what's possible using the Graph API. We've looked at the difference between nodes and connections, where nodes represent objects like people, places, stories, and so on, and where connections represent the connections between those objects, a user's friends, a user's like, or even an album's photos. And we've looked at how you need to request additional permissions to access more user data, and how you separately need to ask for the publish_actions permission to let the user share stories back to Facebook using your app. That was a good introduction to the Graph API. But next, I recommend you spend some time reading up on two things: Facebook login and Open Graph.